There's a tribute Al Pacino wrote only a few weeks ago that took him several days to finish, the words apparently harder to find than any line he's ever spoken on camera. It was for one name on a very short, very personal list. 5 people Pacino has said actually built him, not the awards, not the box office, just 5 people. And one of them he discovered by pure accident, on a film nobody expected to matter, only to watch that discovery burn out far too soon. Pacino has never ranked these 5 for glory. He's simply told the story, over and over, of what each one actually gave him. Let's go through them in the order he's told it. Number 1 is Robert De Niro, for a friendship that took 21 years to actually show up on screen. Both men appeared in The Godfather Part 2 in 1974, Pacino as Michael Corleone, running the family in the present, De Niro as the young Vito in flashback. But their storylines never crossed, and audiences spent 2 decades assuming they'd simply missed each other by a technicality of timeline. 2 of the most respected actors of their generation sharing top billing on one of the greatest films ever made without ever once standing in the same room as their characters. De Niro had actually read for the first Godfather film too, before Pacino was ultimately cast, in a role that didn't end up working out for him at the time, and by his own account decades later, there was real, sustained pressure from the studio pushing Coppola to consider other actors entirely for Michael Corleone. Pressure Pacino has said he only fully understood the shape and severity of much later in his life, once the 2 men had become close enough friends to compare notes on how close it all came to going a completely different way. That changed in 1995 when Michael Mann finally put them across a table from each other in Heat, playing a relentless cop and the meticulous criminal he's hunting, in a 6-minute diner scene shot at a real Los Angeles restaurant that's since become a masterclass taught in film schools around the world, studied frame by frame for exactly how much tension 2 actors can generate without ever raising their voices. De Niro made one unusual request before they shot it. He didn't want to rehearse. He's so great, and he was smart, because he said he didn't want to rehearse the scene with me, Pacino recalled years later. At first I had my doubts about that, but then I realized he was right. It really made a difference, and that was very clever. The gamble paid off completely. The scene plays like 2 men meeting for the first time, because, in a very real sense, they were. 2 actors who'd spent 2 decades being compared to each other, finally sizing one another up, on camera, with no safety net underneath them. Pacino has admitted the physical demands of that same shoot caught up with him too, injuring himself during the film's climactic foot chase across an LAX tarmac, chasing De Niro's character toward the runway. There I was, in my 50s, and I'm up there really about to chase this guy, he said, laughing about it decades later, still sounding a little disbelieving that he'd agreed to it at all. The 2 reunited for 2008's Righteous Kill, then again alongside Martin Scorsese in 2019's The Irishman, closing out a friendship that started on a film where they never even occupied the same frame, and somehow only deepened with age. 2 men who spent 50 years being handed the exact same kinds of roles, and somehow never once let that turn them into rivals instead of friends. Number 2 is Philip Seymour Hoffman, and this is the one Pacino discovered before the rest of the world had any idea what they were looking at. In 1992, starring in his own long-awaited passion project, Scent of a Woman, playing a blind, embittered, retired Army colonel opposite a young Chris O'Donnell in a role that would finally earn him his first competitive Academy Award after 8 prior nominations. Pacino found himself working alongside a mostly unknown 24-year-old actor named Philip Seymour Hoffman, cast in a small supporting role as a smug, entitled prep school student named George Willis Jr. It wasn't a big part. Hoffman considered it a fairly minor gig at the time, taking it mostly because it meant he could finally quit his job at a Manhattan delicatessen and become a full-time actor. It didn't need to be big. Critics who watched the film that winter walked out remembering Hoffman's few minutes of screen time more vividly than almost anything else in it. That particular blend of arrogance and cowardice he brought to a spoiled rich kid hanging his own friend out to dry. Director Paul Thomas Anderson has said, watching Hoffman in that exact film was the moment he fell in love with him as an actor, describing it later as something close to love at first sight, going on to build Boogie Nights, Magnolia, and Punch-Drunk Love around him over the following decade. Hoffman himself later called Scent of a Woman his true breakthrough role, the film that let him leave the deli counter behind for good and never look back. From there, his career only widened. A Best Actor Oscar for playing Truman Capote in 2005, after 4.5 brutal months spent studying the writer's voice and mannerisms so closely, he later admitted it wasn't good for his mental health. Acclaimed turns in The Master, Doubt, and Charlie Wilson's War followed, each one earning him further Oscar nominations, alongside a parallel life devoted almost entirely to New York theater, where he helped found the Labyrinth Theater Company in the early 90s and quietly donated hundreds of thousands of dollars over the years just to keep its doors open for younger, struggling actors, never once forgetting the scrappy, unglamorous roots that had first shaped him back when a small role in a Pacino film felt like the biggest break of his entire life. But the same relentless, all-in intensity that made him one of the finest actors of his generation carried a darker undertow underneath it the entire time. On February 2nd, 2014, Hoffman was found dead in a rented Greenwich Village apartment at 46 years old, a needle still in his arm. The cause later confirmed as a lethal speedball mixture of heroin and cocaine combined with benzodiazepines following a relapse after more than 2 decades of hard-won sobriety. He left behind his longtime partner, Mimi O'Donnell, and their 3 young children. Hoffman's own family released a short, devastated statement asking only for privacy to grieve. Pacino had given him his very first real shot in front of a camera, back when Hoffman was still an anonymous face slicing meat behind a counter. He also got to watch, over the next 22 years, exactly how far that single shot could carry a genuinely rare talent, right up until it couldn't carry him any further. Number 3 is Michelle Pfeiffer, for an audition that went sideways in the most literal way possible. When Brian De Palma was casting 1983's Scarface, Pfeiffer, only 23 and fresh off the notoriously maligned Grease 2, auditioned for the role of Elvira Hancock again and again over the course of 2 exhausting months, and by her own account, got progressively worse with every single attempt, undone by nerves and the growing certainty that she simply didn't belong in a room with a talent like Pacino's. Her first reading, done for De Palma and the casting director alone, had actually gone brilliantly. Everything after that unraveled. I just didn't have a lot of experience under my belt, she admitted decades later. I was terrified. I didn't feel worthy. I didn't feel like I had the chops. Pacino wasn't sold either. He just was like, "She's bad," Pfeiffer recalled, without any bitterness in the retelling. De Palma nearly cut her loose entirely, walking over one day to tell her gently it just wasn't going to work out. A rejection Pfeiffer has said she was almost relieved to finally hear after months of dread. Then, a month later, unexpectedly, the call came for one final screen test, a scene near the end of the film where Elvira throws dishes across a room in a drug-fueled rage. Pfeiffer, convinced by that point she genuinely had nothing left to lose, stopped performing Caution and threw herself into the scene completely for the first time in the entire process. When the director yelled cut, everyone in the room noticed blood on the floor. It wasn't Pfeiffer's. She'd accidentally shattered a plate and cut clean into Pacino's hand without either of them noticing until the scene had already ended. I think then he liked me, she said about it years afterward. I think that was actually the turning point. The role that had reduced her to tears most nights during the shoot, filming for 6 grueling months while starving herself to look convincingly strung out for the film's final scenes, became her genuine breakthrough, launching a career that would eventually include Batman Returns, The Age of Innocence, and dozens of other roles across 5 decades. The actor she'd accidentally wounded during her own audition ended up married to her on screen for one of the most quoted, most visually iconic films either of them ever made, a partnership that literally started in blood before it ever got to the cocaine and gunfire everyone actually remembers. Number 4 is John Cazale, the one Pacino met before either of them had anything at all, long before either man had any reason to believe acting would ever pay their rent. They crossed paths as teenage messenger boys working for Standard Oil, running errands through Manhattan office buildings, years before acting entered the picture for either of them. I knew from the moment I met this guy, everybody liked John, Pacino said. You just were drawn to him because he was such an interesting person. He was so open. They lost touch for years, drifting into their own separate scrapes at survival, until Pacino, cast in an off-Broadway production of The Indian Wants the Bronx up in Provincetown around 1965, walked into a shared house full of actors crammed into little rooms and attics, and heard someone mention they'd finally found their Indian for the play. Pacino asked who. The director opened a door. It was John. "John, you're playing the Indian," Pacino remembered saying, stunned. That production became the hinge point of Pacino's entire career. Faye Dunaway, already a major star by then, happened to see the little off-Broadway show one night and called manager Marty Bregman and CMA head David Beagleman, who both came down to see it themselves. That was it, Pacino has said. That was the moment he finally felt he'd arrived somewhere real. Cazale went on to play Fredo Corleone in both Godfather films, becoming, alongside Pacino, one of the most quietly devastating screen presences of the entire decade, and one of the strangest, most enviable filmographies in movie history. He appeared in only 5 films across his entire, tragically short career: The Godfather, The Conversation, The Godfather Part 2, Dog Day Afternoon, and The Deer Hunter, and every single one of them was nominated for Best Picture at the Academy Awards, a perfect streak no other actor in the history of film has ever come close to matching. A body of work so small and so flawless, it almost reads like a deliberate statement rather than the accident of a life cut short. In the mid-1970s, he became engaged to a young, then largely unknown actress named Meryl Streep. Then, in 1977, partway through shooting The Deer Hunter, Cazale was diagnosed with terminal lung cancer. Streep stayed by his side through the entire remaining production, reportedly taking a smaller supporting role in that same film, specifically so she wouldn't have to leave him alone on set while he was still well enough to work. Cazale kept finishing his scenes anyway, visibly weaker by the week, refusing to walk away from the part. He died on March 12, 1978, at just 42 years old, months before The Deer Hunter, the film that would earn him his 5th and final Best Picture nomination, even reached theaters, meaning he never lived to see the streak he'd quietly built get completed. Pacino has spoken about him for decades since, with the specific tenderness reserved for the very first person who ever made him believe any of this was actually possible in the first place. The boy from the mailroom who became, in 5 short films, one of the most perfect actors his generation ever produced. Number 5 is Diane Keaton, and this is the one still raw enough that Pacino needed several days and a film shoot in Paris he had to finish first before he could find the words at all. They met filming The Godfather in 1972, Pacino playing Michael Corleone, opposite Keaton's Kay Adams. And Keaton has said the attraction was instant and entirely on her side at first. "I was mad for him," she told an interviewer decades later. Charming, hilarious, a non-stop talker. There was an aspect of him that was like a lost orphan, like this kind of crazy idiot savant, and oh, gorgeous. She'd even asked director Francis Ford Coppola what he thought of Al after their earliest screen test together, telling him simply that she thought he was great. Their real relationship didn't ignite until they returned for The Godfather Part 2, 2 years later, beginning an on-again, off-again romance that ran for roughly 15 years across multiple breakups and reconciliations along the way, with Keaton at one point telling People magazine years afterward that things ultimately fell apart because she genuinely wanted marriage and children, and he never fully committed to giving her either one, no matter how many times they found their way back to each other. They never did marry, to each other or to anyone else during those years. It ended for good sometime around 1990, and for years afterward, according to people close to him, Pacino lived only a few miles from Keaton in Southern California, without either of them ever once picking up the phone. A silence he reportedly explained by saying there was simply nothing left that needed saying, that they'd already said everything that mattered at the time it mattered. Diane Keaton died on October 11th, 2025, from pneumonia at 79 years old. Pacino's tribute, when it finally came days later, read less like a formal statement and more like a man thinking out loud for the first time in decades, finally saying some of what that silence had apparently been protecting all along. Diane was my partner, my friend, someone who brought me happiness, and, on more than one occasion, influenced the direction of my life, he wrote. Though over 30 years have passed since we were together, the memories remain vivid, and with her passing, they have returned with a force that is both painful and moving. She opened doors for others, inspired generations, and embodied a once-in-a-lifetime gift. On screen, she was magnetic, lightning and charm, hurricanes and tenderness. She was a wonder. She lived without limits, and everything she touched carried her unmistakable energy. People will miss her, but more than that, they will remember her. She left a mark that cannot fade. She was unstoppable, resilient, and, above all, deeply human. He closed with a line that felt less like a eulogy than a private confession finally spoken out loud, decades overdue. I will always remember her. She could fly, and in my heart, she always will. Taken together, these 5 names trace the entire emotional architecture of Al Pacino's career. Not the awards or the box office, but the people who actually built him, scene by scene, decade by decade. De Niro gave him a rivalry that somehow never curdled into anything but mutual respect. 2 men who spent 50 years being handed the exact same kinds of roles and simply refused to let that turn them into enemies. Hoffman gave him proof that he could still spot a once-in-a-generation talent before anyone else in the room had noticed a thing, a gift he clearly took no credit for and every ounce of quiet pride in anyway. Pfeiffer gave him a literal scar and one of the great villain romances in American film history, born out of 2 months of terror that somehow, accidentally, drew blood and broke the ice all at once. Cazale gave him the very first real push that got him out of a mailroom and into a life neither of them could have predicted, from a shared attic in Provincetown. And Keaton gave him 15 years of love he apparently never fully replaced, followed by 30 more years of silence he never stopped quietly regretting, right up until the day there was nothing left to do but finally say so in writing. If this look behind the legend of Al Pacino moved you, give this video a like and subscribe to the channel. We'll keep pulling back the curtain on the real bonds behind the performances you grew up watching, because the truths behind these old films deserve to be remembered long after the credits roll.